The following is a PragProg Hero's Journey with Maik Schmidt, recorded in March 2020, presented by the Pragmatic Bookshelf, home of timely practical books on classic and cutting-edge topics. Find us online at pragprog.com and everywhere the finest tech books are sold.
So what I'd like to do is I'd like to start by going all the way back to the beginning of your journey as an author. So you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that before you ever even started writing books, you were already writing book reviews and you were already doing articles for computer science magazines. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
What kind of things were you reviewing? What kind of things were you writing back then?
I was reviewing IT books, computer science books. I started in 2003 for the CT magazine in Germany. It's most popular still in Germany. And interestingly, the first book that I've reviewed, or the first two books that were the review dealing with two books at the same time, was the Pragmatic Starter series, I think, where Dave and Andy started a series where they tried to teach people how to use the most basic tools in software development, like CVS back then, and Subversion and JUnit and unit testing and so on. And I think they've published volume 1 and 2 at the same time. And so I thought it would be a good idea to review them. And I haven't worked for the CT magazine before, so that was the first thing I ever got paid for writing. So it was 2,000 characters, I think, and I just wrote them an email. I looked up the editor for the book reviews on their webpage, and then I wrote him an email. I said, "Here, that's a book I like," and he said, "Yeah, reads good. It's not one of those typical in chapter 1 they write this, in chapter 2 they write this reviews, but you really seem to know your stuff." And they printed it and sent me some money. And by that time I was buying a lot of books. I was really spending a lot of money on books during these times. And then I've learned that the magazine will make the publishers send me those books for free to review, and then I was hooked. So that was really great, getting books for free and then getting paid for writing the reviews. That's where my writing career started. I started also to write small articles, 3 to 4 pages, about various things. I remember writing about OpenID and all that stuff back then when it was still cool.
Yeah.
And I wrote, I think, something about video games also. I don't quite remember. And then in 2003, also the company I was working for got bought by an American company that was doing traffic telematics, and their headquarters was in Dallas, Texas. And in 2005, I think, if I remember that correctly, I had to visit the headquarters for the first time, that is going to Texas. And the first thing that came to my mind was, that's where Dave Thomas lives. And when I got there, the first thing I did in the hotel was writing him an email and just telling him that I'm from Germany and I'm in Texas right now, and I'd really love to meet him in person because it was one of my heroes, one of the guys who wrote the Pragmatic Programmer, and he was so nice. I've got back a response, I think, within an hour, and he offered me to pick me up the next day at the hotel. And to go to a local meetup, a software developer meetup, and we went to Starbucks first. It was such a great day. He was such a nice guy, and we talked a lot about the stuff that was hip back then. That is a lot of Ruby. I think they published the Pickaxe book back then, and to me that he made a great impression. He was such a nice guy, a gentleman, and very smart and very funny. And he asked me if I could imagine to write a book, for example, about Ruby, because of course there was not a lot of stuff about Ruby back in those days. It was way before the hype. I think Ruby on Rails even did not exist at that time. And I got back to Germany, and I thought, yeah, why not? Why not? And then I started to write a proposal. There was a proposal process even back then. It was not as elaborate as the proposal system that is in place now, but still. And we quickly agreed on a table of contents, and that is when I wrote the enterprise recipes with Ruby book. Yeah.
Oh, you wrote enterprise recipes first, but enterprise.
No, enterprise integration. Sorry.
Okay. I thought, oh, interesting. Those have different. Yeah. Those different.
Yeah. Sorry.
That is the first time that I've heard one of our authors, or really any authors, say that it's usually always been the reverse. It's usually always like, oh, I had this idea for a book in my head, and then I had to figure out a publisher. In your case, the publisher said to you, you know, do you want to write a book? Have you thought about? So did Dave, was he the one that said, how about Ruby and how about enterprise integration? Or do you remember, were you the one that said, well, how about Ruby, or maybe even just how about this aspect of Ruby?
So Dave suggested to write a book about Ruby, as far as I remember, and I suggested to write an enterprise book about Ruby, because I've always been working for big companies, for enterprise companies for nearly 30 years now. And to me, that was natural, because I saw that in enterprise environments, there are a lot of things that you can do with lightweight technologies like Ruby back then, instead of firing up a Java web application server for every minor problem that seemed totally overkill to me, and still does. Even today. So I think today it's even worse, because with cloud environments, there is usually no need for those complex type of things like web application servers anymore. But people just got rid of the application servers. They did not get rid of the programming languages that forced them to use application servers in the beginning. So I think even today, people would benefit in many situations from using more lightweight technologies. For protocols, we get that done. So nobody's using heavy stuff like SOAP or such things anymore. But for programming languages, it's different.
Yeah, no, that's definitely true. So it's really interesting. So makes sense how you did the jump. Dave said Ruby, and you thought, well, let's do enterprise. And you were already writing, so going to a book was like, okay, well, you know, I could probably go to a book. What was the proposal process like? Do you remember? I know you said it was more lightweight, but here's what I'm thinking is, because you didn't set out to write a book, how did you even know what to do to say, like, you know, this is what my idea for a whole book would look like, this is what the table of contents would look like? I'm comparing it to the process we have now, and maybe it was much smaller and you didn't have to say all of those types of things, but how do you even do that? The very first time you sit down to go, I'm gonna write a proposal for a book. Do you remember, how did you figure that out? And were you nervous about it?
Yeah, absolutely. These were stressful times for me. I was getting divorced from my first wife, and I was sleeping on a friend's couch. And so yeah, these were interesting times. And I was sitting there in the evenings with my notebook and tried to start writing down a table of contents, basically. And communication happened via email with Dave directly, and he gave me a few tips and some advice, and then we changed a few things here and there, and then they sent me a contract.
So did you have, were you expecting that, yeah, this is definitely going to be a contract, or were you kind of thinking that you didn't know? Because what I'm wondering is, if you didn't know for sure that you were going to get the book contract, how did you feel? The contract comes in, they're like, yeah, this is it. What did you think? I mean, that's kind of a big deal, right? You get your first book contract.
Yes, that was very exciting. Especially, I'm not a native speaker, so you're sitting there with a contract that is not very heavy on the legal side. So it's really one of the nicest contracts I've ever read. It's just awesome. So you could really understand everything, and I really had a very good feeling when I signed it and sent it back via snail mail to Texas.
Oh, wow.
Back then, yes, of course, we did not have that digital signature stuff that we have now. It was very old school, and I had a lot of problems on my mind. I was looking for a new place to live. I had to buy a car and all that, and then there was that books thing. But I think it kind of kept me sane and helped to focus. There was some, let's say, piece of order in my life, something that I could always go back to when I needed to just flush out everything that was going through my mind. So it was kind of therapeutic. So that was. I was a bit afraid before I signed that contract, because I knew this is going to be a lot of work, but it actually did help me.
Yeah. So for the second book, which is the Enterprise Recipes, at that point, do you remember, did you go back to Dave and Andy, I suppose, at that point and say like, hey, I want to do a second book? Or was that a case where they came to you and said, would you do a recipes book based on that now?
No, actually, I've approached them because I still had a backlog from the first book, all the stuff that didn't make it into the first one, and the first one was quite a success. And so I thought it would be a pity to just throw all that away. And while I was writing the book and after the book got published, I actually learned way more about Ruby, and Ruby was growing, and now there was Ruby on Rails, which was a total game changer for Ruby. So Ruby got more and more popular over time, but when Ruby on Rails came out and was adopted, then the adoption curve of Ruby was exponential. So there was that hype around the language that no longer exists for non-obvious reasons. I'd say it's still a great language, way better than back then, and Ruby on Rails is still an awesome framework. But I think it's one of the diseases that we have in the IT business, that things get old and uninteresting for no obvious reason, just because there are things that are newer, that are more recent, even if they are not necessarily better. Quite the opposite in many cases. So that is really, really a pity. So we have to relearn a lot of things that we already knew 5 years ago, and we're doing that for 3 decades now. And I think wasting a lot of energy.
Yeah, I definitely feel that way as a software developer. A lot of times that you start reading about some new trend that's taking off, and when you really start to boil down, what is the essence of this, you go, wait a second, this is an approach that we took 10, 15 years ago. Maybe some new, maybe there's a new language or something, but we're kind of coming full circle to where we were with this as a concept a while back. And maybe it's that we need to kind of go off and explore other ways to be really sure that this is the right path forward. I don't know, but it does feel that way a lot of times. And you wonder why did we abandon this or that in the first place when there's only like an incremental change? It feels like the jump from A to B should have been much smaller than all the steps that we took in between. But
I saw a great talk by Uncle Bob recently, where he examined the development of the necessity of software developers on this planet. So he had a look at 1960, where the whole world probably needed 5 programmers. And then he watched what the trend was developing like. So by the 70s and 80s, demand increased and increased. And today we need twice as much software developers than we have now every 5 years.
Wow.
And that implies, interestingly, that half of all developers have less than 5 years experience. So
yeah, you're right.
and that explains a lot, I think.
Yeah.
So that explains why we have to relearn so much, so often, because we need all these unexperienced programmers, of course.
Yeah.
Many smart people, but by nature they do not have a lot of experience. They do not know all the old stuff and all the stuff that we suffered through already. So they come up with ideas that often are very old.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Well, so talking about kind of that progression, now that I know a bit more about your progression, I can see how you went from writing reviews and writing the articles. It's very funny. I had no idea that you had reviewed a couple PragProg books, and so then you end up in Dallas and you can contact Dave directly. So I get, now this is how you get to a book. Ruby makes sense. You were doing it. You were doing enterprise. So then let me ask you this. Next up, Arduino, a quick start guide. Where do you get the idea for that? And where does that come from? Because I'm assuming you weren't doing anything with it professionally at that point. I'm assuming you were still doing enterprise stuff. So how do you get to that idea?
And that was something that I barely understand myself. I've always been interested in electronics, especially as a young boy. But back then, when I was young, it wasn't that easy to get into electronics. So you only had some very, very strange, awkward shops where you could buy stuff like capacitors and resistors and all that. There was not a lot of literature that was approachable. So if you weren't studying the topic, then you had no chance understanding that. So I built a few detector radios and all that, like the stuff that kids do, but I never did anything more elaborate or sophisticated. And I never forgot about the idea of learning more about electronics. And I think it was around 2008 or so, when the Arduino project became more and more popular. And I was hanging around in the right forums, and I was reading the right blogs, and I bought 1 or 2 of those. And the first thing I noticed when trying to rebuild some of the sample project that you could find on Instructables or the maker sites and all that, was that it wasn't that hard to grasp the electronics, but the code of the projects was really, really bad. It was code that was written by people who never learned to write code. Most people even did not understand what programming language they were using. So the Arduino IDE was always based on C++. So you had the whole world of classes and object-oriented programming at your hands, and nobody was using that. Most people thought that you programmed the Arduino in an Arduino language. Because there were some special macros that were defined automatically. You did not have a main program. You only had the loop and setup functions like you had in processing before. So it did not really look like C or C++ when you had a first look. But when you were thinking about that, and when you were having a look at the output of the make files, then you quickly realized, yes, this is C++. So why not write clean code? And that's when I got the idea of writing the Arduino book. So I wanted to combine that. I wanted to write an Arduino book for people like me who had an interest in electronics and had no clue and no education whatsoever in electronics, but who knew a bit about software development. And I tried to write the book describing my journey, how I got into the whole Arduino system ecosystem, and how I learned to use resistors in combination with LEDs, and how I learned to read temperature sensors and all that, and I think nearly all the code in the book was code that I got from some project site and that I have completely rewritten. And just to turn it into something that I, as a software developer, think is appropriate. I mean, only because it's a microcontroller doesn't mean that you do not have to follow the best practices of software development anymore. Quite the opposite.
Oh yeah.
I mean, these are very special devices with lots of limitations, some very strange limitations that you would never find on a bigger machine, on a PC or a Mac or some kind of server. So still, it makes sense to structure and implement your code as clean as possible.
Yeah.
And that's how the Arduino book came from idea to life.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so it actually does makes a lot of sense, and it kind of all follows naturally. So let's go back to the first book again then. Let's go back to, you got the contract in hand, right? You're like, okay, this is great. I'm going to start writing it. Doing book number 1, you must have had some expectations about what it would be like to write a book. Did things go like you expected? Were there any surprises about writing a book? Or was it all just, yep, this is what I thought it would be like, and that's exactly what it was?
I think no book is the same. So usually your personal circumstances affect your writing a lot. How much time do you have to write a book? How much, let's say, quiet time do you have to write that? How much time do you have for experiments? How's the competition like? So when I was writing the Arduino book, there weren't many Arduino books out there. Have a look at the book market today. Just search for Arduino on your favorite bookstore. It's the hundreds of books. So there is always some pressure. The Arduino book was very heavy on the hardware side. So back then, I think we didn't have any real good websites, online shops in Germany or even in Europe where you could buy parts from that I needed. So I always had to order stuff at American shops. And so you had to wait for them 4 weeks if you weren't willing to spend hundreds of dollars for express packages and all that. So that was different because of the topic.
Yeah,
it was not only software development, it was a topic that I was not very familiar with. So all the electronic stuff, I had to learn a lot while writing this book. And still managed to write it in a way that would help people like me, complete newbies, to actually understand that. And that was something that was incredibly difficult. So when I think I rewrote the sections about pull down resistors 20 times until I was satisfied that, yeah, that's how a 7-year-old would understand that. And that was something that was very important to me. That was quite different from the Ruby book, of course. I've programmed a lot of Ruby, and I was very, very familiar with the topic. With the Arduino book, it was completely different. And I was trying to hit a moving target. The Arduino landscape itself changed a lot during that time. So you got lots of updates for libraries and the IDE itself and all that. I always try to keep up with the latest and greatest stuff.
So would you say the Arduino book was actually more difficult to write than the Ruby books? Because I haven't talked to the first author I've talked with who was writing a book that was so based in hardware too. So I've never had anyone else talk about the problem of I had to get the hardware, I had to get the stuff. You know, everyone else is just like, oh, I just had to, you know, I had to come up with good projects for my code or whatever. But you had this whole other layer. Do you think it made it overall that was a harder book to write than the Ruby books?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I remember nights when I was debugging circuits with my basic knowledge
Yeah.
of debugging circuits, and that was really a stressful time. It was way more rewarding than the Ruby and then writing the Ruby book because I've learned so much.
Oh.
I've not only learned so much about electronics and the Arduino ecosystem, but also about describing these things for people who would have to go through all that, and I could prevent them from doing that, I think.
Yeah.
Because I got rid of all the, let's say, stupid stuff that really happened just because I was too stupid to understand that, and could write it down in a way that would actually help to people to understand that and to avoid the pain of learning it by themselves.
Let me ask you another part that I think could have been a challenge. I mean, your English is obviously excellent. I've never heard you say anything or not understand something, or your English is perfect, but it's not your native language. So for that first book especially, you know, you mentioned the contract, getting a contract in a foreign language, but now you're going to go, I'm going to write a whole book in a foreign language. Did you have concerns about that? And we get an awful lot of proposals from, you know, people whose for English is not their native language. Do you have any sort of advice that you would offer those people as they think about, like, I think I can do this, I'm going to write a book, you know, in a foreign language?
My advice is don't be afraid. If you have something to say, then you will be able to say it in English if you have a basic and decent understanding of the language. So you do not have to be perfect. Two things I've learned when writing all these books: there are people, editors, who speak English way better than most native speakers. So there are even differences between native speakers that are huge. And the second thing is, and I think that's even more important, it's not my mother tongue, it's not my native language, and that forces me in many cases to find a simple sentence instead of writing a complicated one. I don't even have a chance in many cases to come up with something that is complicated because it's not my native language. I have sometimes, of course, problems finding the right words, finding the right grammatical structure, whatever, and then I think, let's write 2 simple sentences, that's it. And that's exactly what's needed. So under some circumstances, it's even an advantage to not be a native speaker and write.
I could see that. You know, I've read your books, and I can honestly say that when I read through them, I thought it's so, like, they're so clear, they're so easy to follow, and I thought, you know, this is perfect for tech books. You know, you read through, you're like, yeah, anybody can read this, anybody can follow. It never dawned on me to think, you know, that in this case, that was an advantage. That was right. You might not have thought of a construction that was some sort of poetic, flowery construction. And this is exactly what you want in these types of books. So that's a really great point. And that's something I definitely plan on bringing up with other non-native speakers in the future. Like, you don't have to be afraid. In fact, it could be to your advantage,
Yes.
you know, when you go to write books in this area. So the language part makes sense. You've written a decent amount of books at this point. Is there anything that you still think, if you were going to sit down and write a book today, is there something that you think could be a particular challenge of writing it? Or do you think at this point you've written enough that it would all just kind of just come out just perfect right onto the screen?
I think it depends on the topic. When I write about something that I'm familiar with, then writing is more or less a craft, like any craft you can learn. So there is not a lot of differences, to me at least, between writing prose and textbooks and writing code. It all requires a certain mindset, some flow, as they say, and some discipline. So I've never experienced something like writer's block or something like that. It's usually it's about the process. So you have to sit at your desk. So you have to plan, you have to schedule the writing 2 hours a day or whatever fits your schedule best. And then you will sit there for 2 hours. If you don't write anything, yeah, bad luck. But usually it works. So you have to avoid distractions at any cost and all that. But when I'm familiar with the topic, then it's just writing. You sit there and write and write and write and write. And usually I only need one round of editing then. It's different when I'm writing about stuff that I'm not familiar with.
Yeah.
Then I get distracted by myself. Then you start to research things. You start to Google things, and then it's 2 a.m. and you're on Wikipedia, and you think, wow, I didn't know that cows can do that. And, that is still difficult. I've learned that when I'm in such a situation, and that is true for software development or doing software architecture work or whatever, that I stay away from the computer, that I take paper and pencil and try to find a quiet place and think and do a lot of notes for researching. But researching is a different task. It's completely different from writing. And writing should be, at least for me, it has to be something very clean and pure. It's a writing process. So I can write it down when my thoughts are clear, when I totally know what I'm writing about. That was the stuff that I did with the Arduino book. I completely separated all the electronics experiments and the stuff from the actual writing. I never wrote with some circuits next to me. That would have been way too distracting. Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, you definitely have a different approach to it than I've heard some other authors. But your approach makes a lot of sense, and I can see why that would work. And again, I think part of it is some of the topics you've written about are just a little different, and so you end up having to do different things. Well, let me ask you this. A lot of the first-time authors I talk with, they think about, like, I'm going to write a book because this is what I'm going to personally get out of writing a book. Some of them think they have like a bestseller on their hands, or they're like, my book is going to completely change how the world does software development, and it's pretty unusual that either of those things happen. I mean, yes, they can happen. Those books do come along that are the bestseller, that change the industry, but it's usually uncommon. And usually what happens is if you talk with that same person after they're done with the book, they're like, those things didn't happen, but something really good did. And they'll tell you about some sort of, really great thing that came out of writing, something that was rewarding. And so I guess that's my question for you is, having written several books, what would you say for you is rewarding about writing?
There are a couple of things. What was most rewarding, of course, was positive feedback. When you actually read reviews online, especially from people that you yourself admire, and they're writing about your book, that's very cool, very exciting. So and all the emails or forum posts that I got, and all the personal let's say things that I got at conferences because people learned something new or changed their mind about something, that is very rewarding. You cannot buy that for money.
Yeah.
And of course, there are many small things that happen to you as soon as you're published, and let's say, more or less successful author, you get invitations to conferences. People would like to have you as a keynote speaker. I remember that I got invited to PenguinCon in Michigan in 2013. That was completely unexpected. I haven't heard about that before, and it was awesome, really. And that is something I would have never experienced if I haven't been a published author.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, it helps you with your CV.
Yeah.
It at least it doesn't hurt. You have to be careful. I had interviews where people asked, "Will you be able to spend enough time for the company if you're writing so much stuff in your spare time?" And you have to be prepared for that. If you're a published author, and even if you only wrote one book or two or whatever, be prepared for questions like that, especially in the enterprise environment. There it happens often.
Yeah.
I really got that question very often, actually. Yeah.
That's interesting.
I usually have to explain. So I do not watch TV, and
you're like, this is it. This is the only, in my free time I write. That's all.
Yeah.
Right. Normally you just think about the benefit of people seeing it on the CV, going, "Oh, fantastic, great, you're going to be an expert in this." But right, if they think a little bit more about it, then they could start to wonder, well, what else are you doing? What else is cutting into your time? And if we need you to do things,
yeah,
so it makes sense. It's a really interesting point.
Yeah, and you have to, of course, have written a good book, at least a decent one.
Right.
It could backfire very quickly. Yeah.
Well, so this is an interesting connection for me then, that yes, writing a book can lead to these other types of things. It can also potentially have a downside of someone in an interview asking you if you're going to have the time to do it. But here's what I've noticed is, so like you're a software developer, you're writing articles, you write books, you talk, you do all these different things, right? So what would you say the relationship is between the writing part and all these other things? Is it that they come from the writing, or the other way around, you do your job, so you write about something? Like, what would you say the connection is between being a writer and all these other things that you do?
It's a bi-directional process. So the writing helps me to think clearly about a lot of the stuff that I'm working with on a daily basis. It also helps me to find new ideas because of the research that you automatically do when you're writing about a topic.
Mm-hmm.
And even if you think you're totally familiar with the topic, you usually find out when writing about it that there's still a lot that you can learn, or that there are related technologies or subjects or whatever that you never heard about that are very interesting, and that is very helpful. So writing helps me to, let's say, create a journal of all the stuff that I don't know, but in that negative space sense, like on photographs. Mm-hmm. So all the stuff that I write down is the positive stuff, but I can clearly see the negative space around it with all the stuff that I haven't written down, but that is there, like dark matter. You cannot see it, but yeah.
So let me just say that you do have the ability to be very poetic in English. So it's not entirely true that, because that was a very poetic way of putting that. But that paints a very clear picture. I really like that idea a lot. That's a great way to think about writing and what it is that how you see the negative space, how it teaches you what you don't even know and didn't even necessarily would know was there before you started doing it. So finally, you've published several books with us. In fact, I think all of your books have been with us, at least the English language ones. And of course, that makes us very, very happy. We love working with you. I know personally that our readers love your books. So here's my question for you. You could publish realistically with any publisher you want. Why have you chosen to do your books with PragProg?
First, I've chosen the PragProgs because I admire Dave and Andy so much for all the stuff that they have written and produced over the last two to 3 decades. For me, that was totally clear. when I'm going to publish a book then with the PragProg. So it was quite a nice coincidence that they decided to create their own publishing business when I started writing. Today, I'd say it's because the PragProgs practice what they preach, and you don't find that, I think, with any other publisher. So if you have a look at the book publishing process they have, it's a developer's dream. So you handle your book with a source code management system. Everything is fully integrated. You have continuous integration, and that was even back then when I started to work for them. And for a software developer, at least for me, that is very important. I could not work with a publisher who tells me to send in a 200 pages Word document in a year. And yeah, that's not too unusual in the business. Still, I know of a lot of colleagues of mine who also wrote books, and I saw some really, really horrible things. And the most important thing is the people. So all the editors I've worked with at the PragProgs were awesome, really, on a personal side, and on a very, very high professional level. I've learned so much about writing with each and every single book that I would have to pay hundreds and thousands of dollars for courses in writing, I think, to learn all that. Yeah.
Wow. Well, like I said, Mike, I can tell you that we love working with you. I know our readers love you, and you know, we can't wait for you to come back to us and say, I have my next idea. I'm ready. Let's go, because we're ready. So
yeah, the kids are,
oh, yeah. you have one.
True. They are growing. So of course, time became a very precious resource over the last years, but it's getting better and better. Yeah. So let's see.
Oh, that would be great. We can't wait. So thank you very much for talking with me today. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you.
This has been a PragProg Hero's Journey, brought to you by the Pragmatic Bookshelf. For the best in tech book publishing, visit us online at pragprog.com.